You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, I'll be having a fireside chat with an atheist. Greetings, and thank you again so much for taking a little bit of time to tune into the GodArchy podcast. Before I get into the subject of the day, which is going to be a fireside chat with the atheist, as you just heard, yes, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We like doing things that are different here at the GodArchy podcast, so definitely going to do something different. But before I get into that, I want to point out an article that I published at the GodArchy website about a week and a half ago. That's at godarchy.org, and I'll link to this article on the show notes page. We had another pretty prominent Christian thinker extolling the virtues of socialism. This time it was David Bentley Hart, and he published an op-ed in the New York Times talking about how we need to relax about socialism, and basically mocking those of us who believe that socialism, even democratic socialism, is a path towards tyranny. And he was definitely right, spot on. If you like condescending, there's no doubt about that. But I responded to his arguments, and this is not unlike the arguments that we got from Aubrey and Hendricks over at Sojourners about a month ago that we actually did a podcast episode refuting what he was saying. But it's basically the same argument that Hart's giving. It's that socialism is moral and it's virtuous and it's rooted in Christian values. And my intention, my purpose, one of the main things that I want to do with GodArchy is to make people recognize that all of these things that they're calling moral and virtuous aren't, because they are rooted in violence, coercion, and force. I don't care if you think that you're promoting justice and that you're going to fix the world's economic problems, which you aren't because you don't understand economics, but that's a whole different issue altogether. But these things, while they may be the best of intentions, if you are doing it by hitting people and taking their stuff, it is not moral, nor is it virtuous. And I think people hide behind government. I want these people to own their violence, because ultimately they want to lock all of us who don't want to go with the program, who don't want to fund all of their political experimentations, that don't want to go along with all of their programs. They want to lock us in cages, and they are willing to use the threat of death to do it. And they don't see that because they're hiding behind this veil of government. They think government is this benevolent institution and it's democratic and we're all voting. No, it's men with guns. When you strip it all away, that's the bottom line. This is all based on men with guns. So I would really appreciate it if you would check out the article. Again, I'll link to it in the show notes page. The Mises Institute also published the article over at Mises.org. I really appreciate those folks and the work that they're doing. And I just wanted to point that out because, again, that is one of the primary focuses of GodArchy. I want to strip the mask away from government. I want to pull that veil aside, and I want people to have to stare into the face of the naked violence and force and coercion that they are embracing and advocating, and then calling it moral, just, and rooted in Christian values. It's a bunch of bull honky, and it needs to be crushed. So, with that, today, we're going to have a fireside chat with an atheist. We're actually going to be talking with my good friend Alan Mosley. Some of you might be familiar with Alan. Alan is the host of the Gold Standard with Alan Mosley podcast. He recently had Ron Paul on. Great podcast. Highly recommend it. He is also the co-host of Postcards from Somalia, which I think is the best podcast title ever in the history of the world. He does that with Sherry Voluntary. And then Alan and I also do a sports podcast together called Sports Ball. So I know Alan well. We've worked together for quite a while. I count him among my close friends. And we were talking one day, and we just thought it would be a good idea for us to sit down and have a conversation between a Christian and an atheist who share the same political philosophy. Uh, the the real point of this is to find common ground. We spend so much time, especially in the liberty movement, which is, it's really sad. We spend so much time fighting with each other and finding little ways to divide up. And, um, I think there is a little bit of a divide between Christians and atheists in the movement, especially the militant Christians, the militant atheists. I admit I get frustrated with some of the folks who want to mock me as a believer because, I'm praying to the sky daddy and all of this ridiculousness. And Alan has his own frustrations with people that are believers. So we just thought it would be a good idea to talk about some of these issues and also talk about our political views. And I think the best part of the interview is toward the end when we get into a little bit of a conversation about war. And right there, you will see where our two worldviews definitely come together. But we also talk a little bit about some things that frustrate us about the other side, so to speak. I talk a little bit about some things that frustrate me that I hear from militant atheists, and he talks a little bit about some things that frustrate him with people that are Christians. So it's a really cool conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it. I think I'm going to try to do more of these. I'd like to do a whole series of fireside chats as a way to kind of start these kind of dialogues and build these kind of bridges. I'd love to do a fireside chat with a Muslim. Maybe I'll do a fireside chat with a statist or something like that. So before I get into the interview, I am going to play a little message from the good folks over at the Midwest Peace and Liberty Fest. And then after that, we will roll right into our fireside chat with an atheist.
It is your right, your duty, and your privilege to attend the 7th Annual Midwest Peace and Liberty Fest held at the Circle Pine Center in Delton, Michigan, just outside of Kalamazoo, from Thursday, June 20th to Monday, June 24th. This is the most important Liberty Fest of our lifetimes. This is both an adult and family-friendly camping event. There will be all sorts of outdoor activities, games, discussions, and bacon. Lots of bacon. Scheduled speakers will include C.J. Kilmer of the Dangerous History Podcast and Brett Venat from School Sucks. Make sure your voice is heard by rounding up your friends and family and getting them registered today at mplfest.org. That's Mike, Papa, Lima, Fest.org. Dogs welcome, longer leashes recommended, and a vote for Anarchon is really a vote for Agorafest.
All right, I'm here now with my good friend Alan Mosley. So, Alan, you're an atheist.
I am.
Why are you on my show? I should have you physically removed.
Well, you don't even have to, though, because I'm going to burn in hell in like 50 years from now.
You're going to last that long? I thought you were dying at 40.
Oh, that's right. I'm going to... Oh, well, way to ruin my week, Mike. It's, at the time of this recording, it's Monday afternoon. It's already ruined.
So I've already explained in the fabulous intro to this episode kind of what we're doing here. We're having just a little fireside chat between two people. We've been friends now probably over a year now, right? We knew each other before that, but we've been kind of hanging out and doing projects together. And I think a lot of people, I'm going to generalize a lot in this episode about Christians and be a little bit collectivist. But when I do that, I'm talking about kind of mainstream evangelical Christianity, because there's definitely, there's definitely a team there. And part of what GodArchy is meant to do is to kind of shake up the team a little bit on some things. So one of the ways I thought would be a good idea is talk to an atheist, because it's interesting. Well, let me just back up a second. Let's start off this way. A lot of times in the world of the church and Christianity, we'll give our testimonies. How we came to our spiritual journey, so to speak. So I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to give you a history. How in the heck did you become an atheist? Were you raised in a home that was not religious, or was there some point that you said, "This is just dumb. I don't believe this," or kind of how did you come to the position that you are now?
Well, let me just first say before I answer that question that I'm really glad that you're the one doing the generalizations of Christians, because that way you can take the heat.
Right.
Whereas if I were the one to do that, they would say, "Well, why
Oh,
is
that
it,
stupid atheist."
why don't you read the Bible?" So I actually grew up in a home where religion was not mandated upon myself or my brother. I have an older brother, and I've been to church before. Anytime a friend has ever invited me to go to church, to go to their church, I've never said no. I've always taken them up on their offer, because I understand that that's a way for them to include their friend in that part of their life. So I've always done it at least once. But my parents both grew up in religious households themselves, but they did not raise us that way. So I think my mom was Methodist and my dad was Southern Baptist. So I mean, my dad would have been growing up in Clarksville, Tennessee, in the 1950s, and then my mom was here in Columbia, Tennessee, in the 1960s, and religion was a big part of the lifestyle and culture for them, just like it is today for most people in this part of the country. But we were not a church family. We weren't going to church every Sunday. If by some crazy chance one of them went to church, we were not forced to go, which, surprise, surprise, if you give two young boys the opportunity to either play Nintendo or go to church on
Right.
Sunday morning, which one do you think they're going to do? So that was just not something that came to be a routine. And that's something that I've kind of I wouldn't even necessarily call it a criticism. It's more just an observation that some of the most devout people that I know, really good friends of mine, that the church is a big part of their life. Most of them, it's always been, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you've got those Johnny come lately converts, but by and large, they were brought into the church as children, baptized at a really early age, Bible school, vacation Bible study, all that good stuff for years and years and years, all the way through their teenage years. And then if so moved, they continue to do that as adults when they no longer had a parent pointing a gun at them saying, "You're going to church this morning," they would still go, because that's become a part of their life.
Right.
That never became a part of my life because I was never forced to adopt it to begin with. And I know to say forced, that's going to trigger some people. But let's be honest, if I'm with 6 and I can either sleep in, watch football, play games, or go to church, which one am I picking with no other prior established bias?
You're going to church, right?
No, I'm not. I'm going to watch the Cowboys.
Right.
Back when they were still winning Super Bowls.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting because I find that people kind of fall into two camps that are not believers. And two camps is probably unfair, but two broad camps. People that kind of like you who just came by it just by virtue of just kind of your own journey. And then I know a lot of people who are probably the most militant atheists I know are people that had that experience of being forced into a very straitjacketed, strict religious home. That was really a bad experience for them. I think for a lot of people it was kind of neutral. It wasn't the first choice, but it wasn't horrible, and they got involved in youth group and they had friends and that. But I know a lot of people that it was very straitjacketing, very smothering, a lot of rules, punishments if you don't memorize your Bible verses and just crazy things like that. And those folks, almost all the people that I know that were raised in those really, really strict homes, once they got out, they never looked back and haven't want nothing to do with anything that happens to do with the church ever again.
Sure.
So, yeah. So here's something that I think is interesting, because you'll run into people who believe that, well, in order to have a well-developed moral or ethical fabric in their life, you have to have religion. And I think you're a prime example of that not necessarily being true, because, like I said, we know each other pretty well. We talk a lot. I would put your moral and ethical framework up against pretty much anybody. and I think that you would out moral and out ethic a lot of people that are Christians. How did you kind of develop your moral ethical framework in terms of? I'm especially interested in. You have a profound respect for life and a profound respect for, not hurting people, not killing other people, not taking people's stuff. Those things that we all as libertarians value. How did that kind of develop in your life?
Well, some people like to use the analogy because I know, and I know this is something that you've talked about on your program, talking about how people that view the religion of the state, that the state is their god and they worship it, and what a shame that is. But you can extend that analogy other ways. So if you make the kind of snarky remark of that, well, the state is their church, and the people who say, well, man, we need laws against murder, because if we didn't have a law against murder, then I'd kill my neighbor. And you're like, wait a minute, you need that law to not kill your neighbor? That makes you sound like quite a monster. But I would even go a step further and say, I don't need religious doctrine to know that it is less than ideal to murder my neighbor.
Right.
And this is really, really basic, but seriously, stay with me on this. We're libertarians, we're capitalists, we're free market guys, and some of what ties into that philosophy is kind of the general. I mean, sure, we're all pursuing our self-interest and all that kind of good, greedy stuff, but you want to act in such a way that things are going to work out the best. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily the best for everyone, and I understand there's some people that do a good job of that. But just work out. Like, I understand, like, I don't have to be Einstein to know that if I start murdering my neighbors, vindication will fall before me eventually.
Right.
Like, you're either going to be the supreme warlord or someone's going to cut you down. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, and I'm not saying that my entire moral code is based on what I think I can get away with. I don't mean that, but I understand. I don't need doctrine to describe to me that that's not a good idea. So, so the golden rule, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. Right. It's something like that, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert.
No, that sums it up pretty good.
So I don't, and this is something I don't want to be the militant atheist, because I'm really not.
No, you're definitely not.
But one place where I do like to draw a line in the sand is I take exception of people of any subset, but for this conversation we'll say Christians, who describe things that are good as Christian and things that are bad as non-Christian. Mm-hmm. Because in my mind, you don't get to have a monopoly over good things because it's and declare it to be a Christian thing. Now, it may be a Christian value. Not murdering your neighbor may be the Christian thing to do, but you're not the only people who observe that. Like, right. Buddhists don't want to murder their neighbor. Muslims don't necessarily want to murder their neighbor.
Right.
I mean, Sikhs don't want to murder their neighbor. That's not, their third commandment is kill your neighbor.
Right.
So you don't get to monopolize good things. And there's plenty of logical, reasonable people out there who it would never cross their mind to do something like that. And they didn't need any type of religious teaching to tell them that. So I guess the big point that I would make is that yes, I do have a profound respect for life and liberty, and I'm a libertarian, and the non-aggression principle and those types of things are principles that help guide my life. But I just don't identify those things as religious concepts, and I know that there's a lot of people that do, but I don't really see those as religious concepts at all, not even a little bit.
I agree with you probably more than a lot of people would suspect. There's a certain order in creation, and maybe I sound a little bit like a deist, and I'm not. But there are certain physical laws. They exist. They're not Christian. They're just virtue of creation, and we can agree on that no matter how we conceive of creation having come into existence. So I can come at it from a deist perspective and say that there was a supreme being that created the world, and you can look at it and say no, it was a product of evolution or whatever scientific mechanism that you perceive. But we can both agree that there are laws that are innate in creation that operate regardless of whatever force is behind it. So I don't really think it's necessary. I agree with you. I don't think it's necessary to, define things like that in a religious sense. And I really try to, in terms of, how I live my life in a moral, ethical sense, or how I try to explain that to other people. I really try to avoid the religious connotations out of respect for all of the people who are not necessarily religious. So, I look at things I usually start my moral, ethical foundation with the idea of self-ownership. And I definitely can give you a theological basis for that. And folks that have been listening to this podcast, we've talked about that before. But you don't have to have that in order to understand the idea of self-ownership. And I think this is important. This is kind of one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you, because I think it's important for people to understand that we can live together in a society with people that we have differences of opinion on religious things, at the same time find a lot of common ground and live together in a cooperative way, and oh my gosh, even be friends, and seek some of the same goals, a lot of the same goals in terms of the way we want to see the world ordered. I don't want to live in a world, I shouldn't say I don't want, I don't think it's possible to live in a world, and I wouldn't want to impose a world where everybody embraced my religious beliefs. That's not my job. My job is not to make Alan be a Christian. My job is to love Alan and cooperate with Alan and get through this life as best we can. And so I think it's cool for us to have this conversation, for people to recognize that while we may come at things from completely different perspectives in terms of how we get there, we view the world in much the same way. So here's an interesting question, and I think this would be interesting for the Christians listening. What is your perception of how your average evangelical Christian, and I think you have a good sense of what I mean by that, living in Tennessee, because you were in the buckle o' the Bible belt, as I am here in Kentucky. How do you view the average evangelical Christian? What do you think they want society to look like?
If I were going to be negative, I would say that the average evangelical Christian thinks that if society more reflected themselves, if their own image was imprinted on society, then society would be better. Which is funny, because I think pretty much everyone thinks that, right? If everyone was like me, everything would be better.
I don't think that, but
well,
maybe I'm a little more self-aware than most people. I think if the world was like what I am inside, we'd be in a mell of a hess.
Well, I guess the point I'm making is that on the one hand, that's something that they don't monopolize. Christians aren't the only ones who probably think that if everyone was like them, things would be better. I'm sure everyone thinks if everyone was like them and everyone had more in common, everything would be better.
Right.
However, I do think that they can be a bit more obnoxious about it. So when a bad thing happens, if a national tragedy strikes and the answer is it's because we've turned away from Jesus, I would say, well, no, like the reason the shooting happened was because that guy pulled the trigger on his gun.
Right.
That's why it happened. It has absolutely nothing to do with the nation and Jesus. It has everything to do with that guy and the trigger he pulled. Yeah. And that's something that grinds my gears, is because you're trying to take something tragic, but also something that's complicated, and you're really trying to boil it down to something simple and self-serving, and that bothers me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like, and And I have an answer to this from my perception, my stereotype view. Do you feel like a lot of Christians want to use government to impose a Christian worldview or they want to create this Christian nation using the force of government? Do
Yeah,
you feel like that?
1000%.
Yeah, so do
Yeah, I don't know if I think you've said this before. I know our friend Sherry said this. They call them Christostatists.
Yeah.
Or Christo-fascists would probably be even better.
Yeah.
And yes, they absolutely are. And again, what's so interesting about that, and this is one of those things, this is what the atheist community, and I don't represent the atheist community
Right.
by any stretch of the imagination, but this is something that your prototypical atheist community members would say, is that it's so like them to look down their nose at whatever the caliphate is in Syria,
Right.
Look down their nose at an ISIS, look down their nose at an Al-Qaeda. But given the opportunity, they would absolutely use the machinery of government to enforce their will upon others.
Yeah.
Tell me I'm wrong.
No, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, because confession time, moment of honesty. I mean, 20 years ago, well, not 20, when I was young, so in my 20s, when I was a young Christian, I was one of those people. I mean, I was all for legislate as much morality as we can. I use the air quotes, legislate morality. I believe that God would have me get my representatives to form the world into a Christian nation. Now, I'm much more mature in my faith now, and I recognize that's an impossibility, because you can't legislate people into a belief. I mean, you can point a gun at somebody's head and make them behave in a certain way to some degree. Of course, you're going to create resentment, and eventually they're going to get a hold of a gun and turn it on you.
Mm-hmm.
But, again, my job is not to argue or force people to embrace my faith. I'm maybe I'm different than a lot of people, but my faith is a very personal thing. I've shared my spiritual journey on this podcast a couple episodes ago. I've been an atheist. I understand that. My job is not to force people. My job's not even to try to argue them into the kingdom. I'm not going to argue you into the kingdom. I'm not going to convince you that my biblical Christianity is true or something that you should follow. That's something that if that's ever going to happen, it's something that you're going to come to on your own terms and your own timing. And, if you ever came to a point and you said, hey, Mike, I'd like to talk to you about this, I'm open to it. But I'm not going to try to argue you into the kingdom. And I think there's too many Christians out there that they really want to impose the kingdom of God on the world. And that's not how any of this works. That kind of segues me into something that I kind of wanted to touch on with you, because you talked about the kind of atheist community. And I think that's a big issue for a lot of people who are not believers. I've got a close friend that I went to high school with that is what you would probably call an atheist activist. Like he's the kind of guy that goes to the school board meeting and would protest the prayer in the school and those types of things. And it's interesting because a lot of evangelicals, they get their backs all, the quills on their back standing up on that. And I actually agree with my militant atheist friend, and I think you would too, is not necessarily militantly atheist, but from your perspective, you don't want somebody else's religious worldview enforced on you by government. As a Christian, I don't want the state's interpretation of my religion forced on people either. Even if I thought that was a good idea, I don't have any confidence that they're going to get it right, So that prayer in school, I would prefer just the state not to be involved in that at all, because, basically the state screws up everything that it touches. I certainly don't want it messing with my religion,
Well, so here's the thing, is that while those two sides are arguing over whether or not they can pray in school, or whether or not you leave God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Here I am just trying to close the school.
Yeah, right.
That's the type of radical that I am, that I'm just thinking, well, maybe they'll argue if they can argue enough that they reach the point that they understand that they can't come to an agreement, so the only option is to close, I will be giddy.
Yeah, you and I both. Let's shut the whole thing down.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple more things I want to touch on. This kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about a minute ago. About you kind of mentioned some of the things that annoy you about Christians. I'll share with you the thing that annoys me about atheists, and you have never done this, so I thank you. I don't have a problem with atheists at all. In fact, I'm very respectful of it. I understand. I have my own questions about my own faith, so I can certainly understand how somebody from the outside looking in goes, "This is a bunch of bullcrap." I totally get it. The thing that frustrates me, and this is where you come from your militant atheist, the thing that really frustrates me are the ones who want to mock me. You know, the ones that'll, "Oh yeah, you and your sky daddy." You know, that kind of stuff really grates on my nerves. Because, I mean, for most of the people that are saying things like that, there are a whole lot of people that are a whole lot smarter than they are that have had, a religious faith of one type or another. So I really resent being mocked for. I don't resent when people question, and say, "I don't understand how you believe this." I get that, but when it's the mocking and like I'm some kind of mental midget because there's a faith element of my life, that grinds on my gears. And you've never been like that. And actually, I have a lot of friends who are atheists or agnostic and have never treated me that way. But most of them are neckbeards on social media, to be honest. But so I appreciate that about you. You've never questioned my intellect, at least not in front of me.
Well, here's the funny thing about it's just the way that these arguments evolve. And this is the way that I normally put things. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've never had an existential crisis. I mean, I have one of those at least every 15 minutes.
I've experienced some of your existential crises. Right?
Yeah. But here's the thing, is that there are people in this world who can't live with not knowing.
Right.
And I get that. Like, that's a human thing, I think. I think it's a natural human tendency to want to know the unknown. If you hand a human being a box and they say, "What's in it?" You say, "Oh, I can't tell you," and they leave the box there and leave, they're going to open the box.
Yeah. Oh, I'm opening the hell out of that box.
Yeah, it's just how human beings are. Yeah. And so humans desperately strive to know the unknown. But there are questions in this world that suffice to say, at this recording, we don't know and probably will not be discovering anytime in the near future.
Right.
So, what the nice atheist would say, who's not being an asshole, would be, "I don't know" is an acceptable answer to a question. Probably my least favorite teachers in a school, of any school, whether they're mine or anyone else's,
right,
they do two things. One, they chastise kids for asking questions. That's a really bad teacher. And two, they don't accept that "I don't know" as an acceptable answer. Yeah. Because if that's accurate, if you in fact don't know, then that is the right answer for you in that moment in time. Maybe that's an opportunity to educate, or maybe that's an opportunity to just shelve that question and reevaluate down the road. But the point being is that "I don't know" is an acceptable answer. So if you say to me, "Alan, where are you going to go after you die?" I mean, the easy answer is probably in the ground. I haven't decided. Maybe the sea. Ooh, let's do a Viking burial. Burn me in the sea.
I definitely want to be scattered in the sea.
Yeah, that sounds cool. So let's do that. The more worldly answer would be "I don't know."
Yeah.
And that's okay for me. I can live with that because, here's the thing. There's a lot of things I don't know.
Right.
And so since there's lots of things I don't know, but I can endeavor to discover, I'm going to focus on those for a while. And we'll circle the wagons back around to the existential things.
Right.
Whereas the other side of that coin is that, so it's interesting that a militant atheist who bases a chunk of their worldview on, I don't know the question to answer X, but I think you're wrong, and then they would mock you
Right.
for having an answer when their position is, I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
That's their framework, is there is no answer, therefore you're stupid. That doesn't really gel with me. Like, I don't know how you draw the conclusion of, I don't know, therefore you're dumb.
Yeah, and you know, honestly, I would turn that the other way as well, because I think I think in a lot of ways we're really maybe on different sides of the same coin in a sense, because I think it's foolish, and I know a lot of Christians who will mock atheists, you know, and act all belittling and holier than thou. And you know, this was a big part of my faith journey, coming to the point where I could say, I don't know, accepting that I don't have all of the answers to all of the questions. I think anybody that's really honest in the depths of their heart, there are things that we don't know. There are things that I think I'm pretty certain of most of the time, but it's faith. I don't know. You know, I don't know in the capital K-N-O-W sense. So how can I be belligerent towards you for saying you don't know? I mean, you lean a different direction than I, but we both really don't know, you know, and I think that's fair. There's room in my faith to say I don't know. In fact, it's integral, because if you have to pin me down to an absolute, I'll give you an example. You know, there are some more fundamentalist strains of Christianity that would say, you know, the earth is 6,000 years old, and Genesis is a literal creation story, and I don't think that's true. So if you ask me, well, how did God create the earth? Well, the answer to that question is I don't know. You know, so I think I don't know is a fair question. I think it's a fair answer to the question. I think it's fair for both of us, and I think people would go a lot farther if they would respect each other's I don't knows, wherever they might happen to be. I got one more thing I want to touch on before we close off, and this doesn't really have anything to do with religion at all. I just wanted to touch on a really fantastic article that you wrote. I guess it's been a couple of months ago, but it was on the atom bombs, and I'd like you to just share a little bit about that, because one of the main things, and I explained this last week. Last week I interviewed Scott Horton, or not last week, but 2 weeks ago. I had Scott Horton on the show, and we talked about America's foreign policy and what a incredible cluster, you know what, that has been, and the real results of it. And I explained then that one of the reasons I started GodArchy in the first place is I want there to be a real, unapologetic anti-war voice from a Christian perspective. That really, for me, number one issue in politics is anti-war. We would go a long way if we could just stop blowing up people in other countries. I don't know. It just seems like a logical thing to me. Share a little bit about that article you wrote on the atom bomb, and why you wrote that, and why that's an important point for people to grasp.
Yeah, so I wrote an article. It was published by the usual suspects, Fee, Mises, Lou Rockwell. And
wasn't that your first Lou Rockwell article?
That was the first Lou Rockwell one.
I said that's like the trifecta of.
I did. I parlayed that into
publishing.
a Lou Rockwell appearance,
which is pretty awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. So I wrote that. You know, here's the thing about the atom bomb is that, and I know you do this too, is that you're, depending on the audience you're communicating to, you try to talk in their language, and you're also kind of preaching to the choir, ha ha ha, for this episode.
Right.
But you know, the anti-war crowd, the libertarian crowd, unless they're, you know, monsters, they're going to already be in our camp that, you know, dropping atom bombs on civilian populations is less than ideal.
Right.
But it's good to tip your hat to that every now and then, because the anti-war position is probably the most important position to have in libertarian philosophy. But you're also talking so more to our statists out there, to our militarists out there, is, well, let me talk in your in your perspective? All right, let's lay this out. Before the bombings took place, when they're evaluating this potential, this potential move, the Truman administration is looking into it. There was estimates for what the carnage could be before it actually happened. So the Joint Chiefs of Staffs were expecting as many as 1.2 million casualties. The staff for the Admiral Chester Nimitz, General Douglas MacArthur, were expecting over 1,000 casualties per day if they were to invade Japan as opposed to drop the bombs on Japan.
Right.
And so from that perspective, and this is the argument a lot of people would make, is, well, we dropped a bomb to end the war so that we didn't have to invade mainland China.
Right.
Like, that's kind of your third grade social studies government school indoctrination.
Right. It's utilitarian calculus, basically, is what it is.
And so by that logic, then you think, well, then, it's really a mercy that they dropped Little Boy and Fat Man because, whatever the deaths were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that pales in comparison to all the U.S. servicemen that would die and yada, yada, yada. But for one, as is often the case, not everyone agreed with that assessment then, just like not everyone agrees with that assessment now. And when I say not everyone, I don't mean the waiter. I mean major figures.
Right.
So you're talking Dwight Eisenhower, for one, who was quoted as saying, "I was against the use of the bomb on 2 counts. First, the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing.
Right.
Second, I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon."
Mm-hmm.
Now, that last one's a very prescient thing, isn't it? Because that last point he made isn't based necessarily on a death count or the right or wrong of American lives or Japanese lives, but that he felt like it sent a message that we wouldn't want to send for our country, this country that's supposedly born under the principles found in the Declaration of Independence of Life and Liberty, to be the first to use such a weapon.
Right.
And then you also have the Secretary of War at the time, Henry Stimson, who also said that he voiced his grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary, and secondly, because I thought that our country should avoid shocking the world opinion by the use of a weapon whose employment was, I thought, no longer mandatory as a measure to save American lives. Mm-hmm. It was my belief that Japan was at the very moment seeking some way to surrender with a minimum loss of face. So that's a second major voice that made it clear that the world was going to change, and not for the better, if America demonstrated to the world that if you stand in opposition to us, we will hit you with indescribable force in targeting your weakest population.
Right.
And that you can't come back from that. And in a lot of ways, you look at foreign policy since then, and maybe they were right.
Yeah.
And so, and the last one, another big one, was Admiral Leahy, William Leahy. And this is where I'm talking to our militarists, right? Our oorah, support the troops.
Right.
Leahy was the senior most United States military officer on active duty during World War II. I mean, this is a military man.
Yeah.
This is what you build the bus out of. This is your bumper sticker guy. And in his 1950 book, I Was There, Leahy wrote, "It was my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated, ready to surrender because of effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons." Mm-hmm. So you've got these aren't nobodies. Fleet admiral, generals, chiefs of staff who are saying, don't do this, because it's wrong, because it's unneeded, and because it will take us to a place. It'll take us to a place ethically and morally as a nation from which we won't return. Yep. Those are deep, deep words coming from 1945.
Yeah.
And I know World War II is particularly a testy subject, even amongst some people in our community, because it brings up the conversation of what is and isn't just war. And some people would argue that World War II was just from a libertarian perspective, perhaps, and that therefore the things that happened in it can be justified. Some people would argue that no, you go way back before World War II to find a war that was just and good for America to be involved in. But no matter where you fall on that spectrum, the lasting ramifications in the way the world changed by the tactics employed in our name by our government has had a lasting, changing global effect. And it actually churns my stomach to think that there are Christians out there in their Christian churches reading their Christian Bibles who would applaud this. How can you do such a thing?
Yeah, as you were talking, I was reminded of something that actually James Madison said. Going way back into the early 1800s. And Madison was actually, this may even be late 1700s that Madison talked about this. He talked about how war creates a degeneracy of manners and morals.
Yes.
And you see that reflected in the comments of Eisenhower and Leahy. It's that road. Once you take a step down that road, you've taken down barriers that you're never going to build back again. And I think in retrospect we can definitely see that. Like you said, it's been the ability. I think the ability to wipe entire countries off of the map has made the United States more belligerent, and I think it has fed what I would argue, and I don't think it's really even arguable, is a quest for empire. That we've seen, and really that started before World War II, but I think that solidified that pathway, that we can be a world empire and there's not a damn thing anybody can do about it. And to the Christian folks out there, and I know a lot of them who they're still comfortable in that utilitarian calculus where they look at it and say, well, it's remember Pearl Harbor, and it's what we had to do, and we could do an entire episode on what led up to World War II, and was it really necessary, and did we maneuver Japan into bombing Pearl Harbor, and we could have that debate. But even looking at the effects of that, I don't think a lot of Christians realize that the largest Christian congregation in Asia at the time that the bomb was dropped was in Nagasaki.
Yes. And
the church that was the primary Christian congregation there, I believe it was a Catholic church, was the target. That was the landmark that the pilots used for ground zero to drop the bomb, to target the bomb. And Christianity in Japan and Asia was never the same. It obliterated that Christian community. And there's a written, I'm trying to think of the word, account, I guess, of the moments after the dropping of the bomb that I've got in a book. And one of the perspectives is one of the priests that was there. And he actually talks about and wrote about how, going through the streets and seeing the decimation. You read that, you talk about your stomach turning. Because these people had nothing to do with the war. They were women, they were children, they were going about their business. It's horrible, and you don't have to be a Christian to be moved by suffering and carnage to that scale, and to recognize it was unnecessary, and it was all part of this religion of statism. And it goes back far farther. We can go back to World War I. We can go back to all of the wars. The wars are based on these jockeying for position of these states. And my opinion is the church should be absolutely separated from that forever and for always. And I think the worst thing that ever happened to the church was when it got in bed with Rome in 400 AD. That was the beginning of the end of that. But anyway, I appreciate your perspective on that, and I appreciate you taking a little bit of time to talk about that. That was a very moving article. I'm going to link to it in the show notes page so people can read it.
Well, I finished the very last thing that I had in that article as my little kind of personal expose on it was actually ties back to the beginning of this interview, was talking about the golden rule. And instead of looking at that as a biblical principle, as looking at just as a human principle.
Exactly.
That I don't want people to hurt me and steal my stuff. Therefore, I don't hurt people and steal their stuff. That I don't feel like you have to have many thousands of hours in seminary
Right.
to get that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although maybe I'm wrong, because a lot of people don't.
No,
certainly
they
don't
don't
portray it.
Yeah, I mean, from a theological perspective, we would say that we are all created in God's image, and that's everybody, no matter what they believe, no matter what their ethnicity, no matter what their race, no matter where they're from. We are all created in God's image. That's a foundational theological point in Christianity, and I think really you want to translate that into secular terms. We are all of one humanity. We're all of the same flesh and bone. Whether it's a religious, we all came from the same thing. We all evolved from the same thing. We're all one human family, and I think we can agree with that. Whether we're believers in Christ, whether we're Muslims or atheists or Buddhists or Hindus or some weird mix, or if we just don't know. And I think that's the message.
Yeah, I agree with that. Something that we had talked about briefly right before we went on is something I wanted to state before we closed, which is it's a shame that we live in a society and a state enforced desegregation such as we do.
Yeah.
And I know that and so all the people out there are going to call me racist, but what I mean by that is I totally support self-segregation,
right,
and I totally support secession. And the reason I do is because I genuinely believe that though we may love the flowery platitudes of "can everyone just get along," I think the answer is no, they can't. But the answer to that isn't, and therefore let's start killing each other and whoever's left wins. That's
right.
not what I mean, that we can't all get along, because I genuinely believe we cannot all get along. What I mean is I think like-minded individuals should feel free to congregate with one another and to form communities and bonds and relationships. And I think unlike-minded folks who cannot live together should be able to separate peacefully and move on with their lives.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because of some involvement in the state and other reasons, sometimes because of people who they can't leave alone. They just can't. It's just not in their being. That's just simply not allowed. It's not allowed for people to go to their separate rooms and play nice. They just can't do it.
Yeah.
And I genuinely want to be an advocate, though it's not a popular position. I genuinely am an advocate of, I don't force the two kids to be nice to each other. I tell the two kids, if it takes my brutal domination to force you two kids to not fight, I'm not going to spend my time and energy to force you not to fight. I would rather you two leave each other.
Yeah.
And go peacefully, and that be the end of it. Is that ideal? No. Does that coincide with everyone saying, can't we all just get along? No. But I think it's the best option we have in a world with lots of very different folks.
Well, if you put it, if you put it the other way, basically what you're saying is, Alan, you're going to tolerate me, and if not, I'm going to punch you in the head.
Exactly.
Well, that's dumb.
Well, I like using the elementary school teacher analogy of
right.
The two kids are shoving each other, so the teacher will say, I'm going to force you two to sit right here next to each other and be nice. No.
Right.
Put them on opposite ends of the freaking room.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. Can people resolve their differences? Of course they can resolve their differences. But some people can't.
Right.
Like, I would love, like, there are going to be theists out there who are going to tell me, Alan, you're going to burn in hell. You should get saved. If your actual official position is that you need to hound me because you're trying to save my eternal soul from flaming damnation, you probably should just stay away from me. because not only is that not persuading me, but frankly, I don't want to associate with you. Right. I really don't. Like, I'm not, and it's not just because you're a believer and I'm not. No, it's actually because of the way you go about it.
Mhm.
I actually detest. I'm not detesting Christianity. I'm detesting you.
Right. Yeah, it's
like
not it. It's you.
as some people like to say, climb down off your cross for just a second and let me explain to you. I'm not denouncing your religion. I'm actually just denouncing you.
Right.
And so let's just agree to disagree and go our separate
Right.
ways.
Well, all right. Let's do that then.
Yeah. So peace be with you.
Right. Before we do that, I want to give you an opportunity to let folks know where they can find all things Alan Mosley. You are the host of a fantastic podcast / video / show thing that I think is one of the best things going out there. I don't know how you're going to top Ron Paul. So good luck with that. But
I thought we were going to have Mike Maharrey. I don't know.
Yeah, that guy, he's a hack.
Well, I tell you what. Yes, I am the host of the Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. That's my flagship program.
Indeed.
I have to emphasize that because I'm one of these retards that does like 3 different programs.
Well, me too.
I also do what is arguably the biggest libertarian sports show in America.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's called Sports Ball with Mike and Alan.
Yeah.
And I also do Postcards from Somalia with Sherry Voluntary, which I don't know if there's another program out there with a better name.
No, there's not. A better name and a better graphic. I love the graphic.
Yeah, it is pretty good. Yeah. So you can find the Gold Standard with Alan Mosley on Facebook, which is facebook.com/TGS Alan Mosley. I'm on Twitter at Alan M. Mosley. That's ALANMMOSLEY. But you don't have to do any of that because you can just go to our website, which is thegoldstandardpodcast.com.
Indeed. And we are all part of the Little L family, as GodArchy is as well. So this is kind of a family affair here that we're doing. But
in Little L Productions, 1/3 of the community is atheist. That's a really high percentage.
It is, but we love you.
Well, thank you.
No, in all seriousness, I really do appreciate you taking that. This show turned out better than I thought in my head. I mean, I thought it was going to turn out good. No, I thought it was going to turn out good, but I think the conversation got deeper than I thought. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
I think what you're trying to say is you just assumed I would come on and spout nonsense and you would beat me down with your Bible.
Well, that's what I was planning on doing.
Yeah.
And I was going to end by telling you you're going to hell, turn or burn. But after your little speech at the end, I decided to skip that part. So.
You know what? I'm gonna leave you with a really 10-second anecdote that's really funny.
All right.
So my friends that I grew up with know that I'm not a believer.
Right.
When I went to Maryville College in East Tennessee, which was a big Presbyterian school, it's a private school. At that school, you are required to take one of the theological courses your freshman year, either Old Testament or New Testament. Mm-hmm. A lot of them took Old Testament because they were New Testament followers, so they wanted a challenge, so they went Old Testament. I took New Testament because, I mean, it's all a challenge to me.
Yeah.
I tell you what, this atheist got an A in that class.
Of course you did, because you're smart.
Well, yeah, but that was back when I just didn't go to class and played music. So it's actually an exception to the rule that I got an A back then.
Right.
But I got an A in that class, and I can confidently remember Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
There you go.
That is the extent of my biblical knowledge, but I also know not to kill people and take their stuff.
Well, and sadly, you are ahead of a lot of people who could cite chapter and verse in every book of the Bible. So,
what about Romans 13, though?
Oh my God. We've done that episode. I think it's episode 6 or 7. We'll link to it in the show notes page.
All right.
Because somebody out there's asking that question.
Yeah.
Well, Alan, again, thanks for taking the time to be on the show, and I'll see you on Sports Ball.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there you go, a fireside chat with an atheist. I hope you enjoyed that. I definitely enjoyed having that conversation with Alan, and like I told him at the end of the interview, I really do think that it went deeper even than I anticipated. So I appreciate Alan being a good sport and coming on the show, and I hope you found some value in it. And like I said, maybe we'll do some more fireside chats with various folks in the near future. So that's going to wrap up the GodArchy podcast for this week. Before I go, if you enjoy what we're doing here, if you think that there is value in what I'm doing, I could use your support. And you can do that over at Patreon. You'll find our Patreon page at patreon.com/GodArchy. And you can be a supporting listener. $5 a month will get the job done. And one of the things that I've committed to do with my Patreon page is that 40% of the support that I get, I'm going to pass on to other organizations or other folks that are in need. And my supporting listeners are going to help me do that. So please consider financially supporting GodArchy. In the long term, to keep it going, I'm going to have to get some financial support. So I would appreciate you prayerfully considering that and visiting the Patreon page at, again, patreon.com/GodArchy. You'll find out more about our supporting listener program. And if you want to contact me, you can do that at info@godarchy.org. And of course, you can find us in all the spots on the web, social media. The show notes page has all of the links that you could ever possibly want. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.
You have been listening to the GodArchy podcast. You can find us on the web at godarchy.org. You can also connect with us on Facebook at GodArchy.org and Twitter at GodArchy. GodArchy is a Little L production. Make sure you check out the other shows on the Little L roster, including The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley, The Sherry Voluntary Show, Postcards from Somalia, and for all you armchair quarterbacks out there, Sports Ball with Mike and Alan. You can subscribe to the GodArchy podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Thanks for listening.